Hello. If you're new here, my name's Adam and I make a YouTube series called the Point and Click Devlog, which covers the ongoing development of an indie game I'm making in a genre you can probably guess from the name. But today's video isn't about that game, it's about this. The weird building at the end of my garden and how I've transformed it into my dream office and game studio. And when I say I've transformed it, what I obviously mean is I got some bigger boys to transform it for me. But anyway, I thought it would be fun to do a little video on the process of taking it from this to this. But before I do that, I should probably caveat this with one thing, and that's that this place isn't like one of those perfect, minimal, super clean offices you might see elsewhere on YouTube. It's got its imperfections and it's a bit rough around the edges here and there, but in my opinion all those quirks only add to the charm, and I think it's a pretty cosy place in here all the same. So if cozy is your vibe, you'll hopefully enjoy this. If you're a Spartan minimalist or a perfectionist, however, you might want to switch off now before I offend your eyes. So anyway, here we go. Okay, so cards on the table. The fact that this outbuilding exists is a big reason why my wife and I chose this house in the first place. I've always wanted a garden office, and this pre-existing structure is A, far better than anything I'd have had built, and B, pretty big as these things go. It's this odd combination design where it's sitting on a concrete base with about a foot of concrete and brick, and then wooden panelling takes over, covered with this corrugated iron roof. I've no idea how long it's been here for, to be honest, but when we viewed the house we could see its potential right away. The guy we bought the place from used to keep motorbikes in it, but all I have in the way of proof of that is this stunning 3-second video of blurry nothingness. So anyway, we moved into the house in December 2020, and at that point the shed looked a bit like this. And that's to say that we were just using it as storage for the mountain of cardboard that comes as part of moving house. These white panels on the walls were like a half-assed attempt at insulation, but since nobody was using it as a living space, that obviously seemed ample at the time. This brick wall here is actually the outside of my neighbour's house, as the shed is essentially 3 walls bolted onto the side of that building. But I'm a fan of exposed brickwork, so we decided we'd keep that wall as it is. The roof already has a couple of skylights built in, which is nice even if cleaning them is basically impossible, and there was a single plug socket wired in here which comes from a cable that runs underneath the garden back to the house. And then there's this window here. So all in all, it seemed to me to be a pretty solid foundation for what I ultimately wanted to make. So keen was I to experience this long-awaited garden office dream that I actually attempted to work in here as it was just before Christmas of 2020. At the time I had this tiny desk from the tiny London flat that we'd moved from, and I sat quite literally between 2 electric heaters on full blast for about 2 working days before I realised that it was actually quite grim and cold and not very glamorous in here. So once COVID settled down a bit, we got some quotes and eventually got someone round to begin converting it. There were a few stages to this that lasted a couple of weeks in total. Firstly, the guys removed all of the existing panelling, stripping it right back to its bare bones, and that allowed them to add in a couple more plug points and some spotlights to replace the strip bulb that was there and which was quite buzzy. They then insulated everything properly with loads of insulating foam and boarded that back up, and then they plastered the whole thing over. That included boxing out the skylights to these square shapes so that we could keep them, but just due to the nature of the job we had to opt for a flat roof in here rather than keeping the beams and the triangular shape of things that was. But it is what it is. This also was where the slightly wonky nature of the building really showed itself. If you look here, there's quite a hilarious slant to the finished roof, thanks to the lie of the supporting beams. It's got a bit of a fairground wacky shack vibe to it in that sense, but you don't notice it unless you're really looking for it. Either way, at this point it was starting to feel a bit less like a shed and a bit more like a room. Painting helped even more in that sense, but it was when the carpet went in that it really quite suddenly felt like a proper room to me. And I know carpet isn't really fashionable in a lot of countries. I used to work with a Spanish guy who kept saying how crazy he found it that every house has carpet everywhere here in the UK. But you've got to remember that it's cold here a lot more than it is hot, so carpet keeps a bit of warmth in, and generally, in my opinion, makes things seem a bit more cosy and homely. So at this point it was kind of done in terms of conversion. I dragged my tiny wobbly desk back in and hooked up my working setup, such as it was, back together. I've got this TP-Link Wi-Fi extender that effectively repeats our home broadband through the plug socket, and that gives me reasonable speeds out here. It's nothing game changing, but enough to do what I need to do, and that includes, streaming games every now and again. We decided to keep this cupboard here despite how wonky it is, because it's useful storage, and I think if I were to try and put something similar on the wall to replace it, it would probably come crashing down on my head. Oh, and my wife bought me some cool white wallpaper that I put over the cupboard doors for scribbling ideas and notes on. I did have to buy a couple of insulation strips for the door, just because there are a few bits with gaps around the frame and they do a decent job of keeping out the cold. Bought a cheap Hisense TV for in here, and that's hooked up to the PS4 and the Switch, but the next big thing to arrive really was the sofa bed, which was another one of those things that really made a big change to the vibe in here. Especially because before that I had this quite epic, elegant gaming setup. The sofa's a decent size and pulls out to this quite big double bed, which we've actually slept on and is pretty comfy, and that effectively makes this room another guest room as well. At this point I had my dream desk on order from a handmade furniture company on Etsy, but that took a while to arrive, so the interim time was more about sorting fixtures, fittings and all that kind of jazz. I've got a HomePod mini in here which I accidentally got some mud on while I was doing the garden, but otherwise that's more than ample for music in here, and because we've fallen pretty deep into the Apple rabbit hole, it can also control some of the stuff around the house by voice. The guitar I got when I was 13 years old is still up on the wall, still adorned with a random selection of Spider-Man 2 and High School Musical stickers that someone ironically bought me from the corner shop at university, and which I ironically put on there, not knowing that they'd be impossible to remove. We put this blind up for a bit of privacy and for when guests stay over. We did a spot of painting, making the inside of the window white instead of its original yellow, and giving this door a Tudor style bit of fake panelling. I put a couple of bits of artwork up too. I had this picture printed, which is basically a photo I took when my wife and I were in Patagonia, with a bit of a filter on it. And then I bought 2 Spider-Man canvases to match this one, which I got as a birthday present about 15 years ago. And before anyone decides to quiz me in the comments, I literally have never ever read a Spider-Man comic. I just like the character generally, and if that makes me a fraud, I guess my punishment is that when I first attempted to put this picture up, it fell off the wall and smashed this plug socket off with it. It's still like that to this day because I'm incredibly lazy and I like to live a life of danger. Although plugs in the UK are a lot safer than they are in the rest of the world, just FYI. Anyway, a couple of shelves, a couple of fake plants because this real one keeps nearly dying, and a final resting spot for my Stadia controller later. We were almost there. And then the big boy desk arrived. I went for this rustic wood top with some simple white metal legs, and let me tell you, having worked for the last 6 years on that tiny 1 meter wide desk, it is so nice to be able to spread out, and especially to do so on something super duper solid. I faffed about doing some very amateur cable management after I'd slotted the desk into place. There are quite a lot of cables to hide, so it's never going to be perfect, but there's generally a combination here of this plastic tubing, some cable pins and shitloads of tape, keeping everything about as tidy as I can be bothered to make it. Again, it's not perfect, but it's okay. So yeah, this is how I have the desk now. I've got my M1 MacBook Air hooked up to the monitor, wireless accessories, and then over on the left is my iPad Pro, which is my illustration machine. The MacBook's USB hub has 2 HDMI cables, so it's also connected to the TV, which is handy if I want to play a game from the Mac on the telly. This elastic band ball, by the way, I made at my first job writing for a magazine when I was 21, where it was also my job to hand out the post in the morning, which gives you an idea as to how senior I was. LED strip lights, of course, because are you even a YouTuber if you don't have them? Although, I'll be honest, I think I've used these about twice ever, mostly because I'm never really in here after dark. And I also bought this cheap cardboard standing desk called Mojo Stand, which just lets me do the odd burst of writing or whatever in a slightly healthier fashion. It's a little bit wobbly, but for the price I would still recommend it if anybody's interested. At the end of the desk is a little electric radiator, which is running into a smart plug that lets me set it to switch on in the mornings before I get in here. I've also got a flick button that turns that heater on and off, although to be fair, since we've gone into summer I've not really had to use the heater very much at all. Oh, and the chair is a Herman Miller that I bought when I first started working from home about 10 years ago. I highly recommend it. I think my back would be in a really bad shape without this chair. And that's about it. So yeah, this is now where I spend a lot of my hours. As I say, it's perhaps not the most Instagram worthy home office or game studio of all time. It's a bit dusty, it's a bit wonky, and it's a bit slapdash in places, but that's very much on brand for this channel. So for me, it is very much a dream come true to have somewhere like this to work from every single day. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope that's been interesting or inspiring in some small way, or maybe giving you some ideas. I don't have affiliate links for anything mentioned, but if anybody wants to know where I got anything that I've shown, write it in a comment and I'll do my best to let you know. I'll be back next week with another normal devlog progress video. Hopefully you might stick around for that. If not, no worries, I won't hold it against you. See you later.